Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Strategic Dialogues, a series from the Stimson Center's Strategic Learning Initiative. Each month, we bring you a candid conversation with an expert on the most pressing security issues in Southern Asia. Strategic Learning, for those of you who are new to our work, is the Stimson South Asia program's suite of resources and online courses on strategic and nuclear issues in Southern Asia. We have a range of free online courses on topics like deterrence, missile technologies, and maritime competition, as well as articles and video interviews breaking down how these topics shape security in Southern Asia. This show is a new effort and part of Strategic Learning's mission to bring in voices from across the region and beyond, offering a wide range of perspectives on key concepts and current events. As always, our guests share their own views, and we know that you may see things differently. We welcome that. This is entirely designed to be a dialogue, and we look forward to hearing your comments and your feedback, as well as your suggestions on whom we should feature in future interviews. Our aim is simply to share thoughtful analysis from people who've spent time wrestling with these issues and to give you more to think about as you explore them in your own way. And I can think of no one better today to have with us than our guest, retired Brigadier General Feroz Hassan Khan. Feroz, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
I'm sure many of you will be familiar with Feroz, but I will take you through his bio so you can get a sense of the perspective that he brings to our discussion and why we're so fortunate to have him with us. So Feroz Khan is a research professor in the Department of National Security Affairs at the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California. He retired as a brigadier after serving with the Pakistani Army for 30 years. He served domestically and abroad with numerous assignments in the United States, Europe, and South Asia. He's experienced combat action and command on active fronts on the line of control in the Siachen Glacier and Kashmir, and served along the Pakistan-Afghanistan border. He last held the post of Director, Arms Control and Disarmament Affairs within the Strategic Plans Division at Joint Services Headquarters, which is the Secretariat of Pakistan's National Command Authority. So Feroz, welcome to the show. I know you've published widely on these issues. You've written 2 books that are must-reads for everyone who's interested in South Asian security that I must mention. The first is Eating Grass, Making of the Pakistani Bomb, as well as your most recent, Subcontinent Adrift, Strategic Futures of South Asia. So really looking forward to diving in and spending the better part of an hour learning from you and getting your sense of how things are evolving in South Asia. So again, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you so much. Always a pleasure to be the Stimson Center. Yeah, so much is happening. Go for it. Yes.
Too much. All right, let's just dive in without further ado. So Feroz, I know you'd seen the interview that we've done with Raji Rajagopalan, which was our first interview last month, and we had a really interesting conversation that I want to pick up on. Some of the elements that I touched on with Raji, I want to bring into this conversation so we can get your view as well. Obviously, many of us who follow security issues in South Asia closely were paying very careful attention to the May crisis between India and Pakistan. And now that the dust has settled a bit, we're now 7 months out from that crisis. I'd like to get your sense of this question of what lessons both sides have taken away from that crisis and what that might mean going forward. And I'd ask you as well to maybe reflect a little bit on a broader context, this idea of nuclear learning in South Asia. So how ideas and lessons around nuclear issues and dynamics are absorbed and are incorporated then into future planning. How did you see the crisis and what lessons do you think have come out of it for both sides?
Well, Elizabeth, thank you so much for this. I mean, as you're asking me, I've been thinking about this issue. I think it's important to frame this in a way that is more understandable. Just not just to pick up a crisis and then start analyzing that. I think it's important to look into the overarching background in which these crises happen, and what has been the focus of. You gave my bio, you gave what I've been writing about. I think the more important context is that when India and Pakistan conducted their nuclear test and declared themselves as nuclear power, the literature, the nuclear learning concept literature, was actually a derivative of the Cold War experience to a regional level. And that was a very different experience altogether. That has been the study that we have been doing here, right in this office where I'm sitting here. for the past 25 years or so, you know. So we went, India and Pakistan showed two different pathways immediately after the nuclear test, with the Lahore Memorandum of Understanding indicating that they're going to have a peaceful cooperative security framework pathway. And that's a document that they signed together that would indicate that conflict would eventually be resolved on a different way. There's no point fighting. It's not going to reach anywhere. So either we're going to live through crisis after crisis after crisis, or we can come to a modus vivendi very quickly, because both sides have nuclear weapons, and therefore we create a different regional model compared to what we had learned from the global level. That transition from the literature and study of global to is still in the making, in my opinion, when you look at the May 2025 crisis. And I think I'm going to put that, because I don't want to get too deep into the history, but it is important to understand where I'm coming from, because now, immediately, rather than the peaceful pathway of the Lahore Agreement and Understanding, we hurtled into Kargil, and then 2001, and on the crisis went on. So those who believed, that in a cautious, optimistic future like me in the beginning, were found to be left out, and those who thought that the complexity of South Asia is so deep and so complex that they're going to be muddling through crisis after crisis, and there will be a series of instabilities of different quality. And we have seen that over the past 25 years or so. I'm just putting 25 years at the turn of the century. We were there, whether we learned from Kargil or we learned from Lahore. What did we do then? Sadly, we went into another crisis in 2001 and 2. At that particular moment, so we were looking into the nuclear learning aspect as to what is South Asia learning over a period of, and we're breaking down into the doctrinal aspects, how the nuclear weapons will be situated in this South Asian conventional doctrine, nuclear doctrine, overall security doctrines of the country. What does it mean for two geographically entangled countries to be involved? Secondly, we're looking at how the command and control and how nuclear management was being done in India and Pakistan and different. What does that matter and all? And that is still been evolving as we speak. We have the 27th Amendment in Pakistan, which will again mean a different configuration of command control. We can talk later if we have time. And similarly, the structural changes happening in India as we speak, So we looked at those elements. And then the third element was, is there a future of CBMs, arms control, peace, security, and CBMs, this pathway to go, and which way? In short, what would be the strategic future of South Asia, which I wrote in my last book, Strategic Futures, And everything that was written in that subcontinent adrift seems to be coming in the shape and form that we talked about, the May 2025 crisis that you mentioned. It was predicted in that, and that's precisely what's going on. And I'm sure you have a lot of questions on that. So you asked the question on nuclear learning. Here in this very office, the first project that was done on nuclear learning, a decade of nuclear learning, and that's an edited volume available on Naval Postgraduate websites for students. They can actually see it's an edited volume. And then we conducted all this. What are we learning? In short, in my view, India, Pakistan took different lessons from each crisis, and then they waited for the next crisis to come back with a different strategy. My colleague, Jeffrey Knopf, who's here in Monterey, right across, he used to be at NPS, wrote the concept of nuclear learning, in which he said, either you do simple learning or you do complex learning. And, he was borrowing from Joseph Nye Jr. and many other, writers of the time. Simple learning means that you don't change your objective. You keep on changing the various means of achieving the same objective, even though you realize that the objectives are non-attainable, primarily because of nuclear weapons or technological evolution. In other words, you're not dissuaded, despite the change, despite the obvious, to change the objectives, that this will not be attainable. Say, for example, either India trying to unite the whole Kashmir under Indian domination, or Pakistan trying to liberate Kashmir through any military means becomes unfeasible, especially with the nuclear weapons and follow-up technological evolution that has happened. It is really impossible to deal, to really come to that, except that it's going to lead to crisis and crisis. That's one simple learning. And the complex learning process was essentially that you try to change the objective, that this is unattainable, and try to reach different objectives, which means that you have learned something different. And I think what we talked about complex learning was, what has India, Pakistan really learned after they got nuclear weapons? Do they still want to carry out with the same prospects? Now, obviously, India believe Pakistan is not reconciling to India's rise. There's been 1,000 cuts, and you hear all those Indian narrative. Raji also explained her interview. She's coming from that perspective, And I agree with a lot that she said, but I'm coming from a different perspective, The Pakistani side was that this is all about domination and hegemonic ambitions of India. Crisis is only an excuse, and India chooses to create a crisis and escalate a crisis because it suits their domestic politics. Otherwise, it doesn't explain as to why would one trigger event lead to a crisis and a reaction in India of a very different sort, and another crisis does not do so, of a similar kind. And a classic example is we saw what happened in Pulwama 6 years ago. We saw what happened in Pahalgam, India's reaction I'm talking about. But as we speak, and just very last month, there was an incident that happened in Red Fort in New Delhi. About 10, 15 people died, We did not see that kind of a reaction coming from Delhi. Now, across what explains that? That explains that there is some other factor that leads to the crisis turning, a trigger turning into a serious crisis of a military nature. We have not been able to resolve because for the 25 years, there have been many such instances that have happened that one has led and one has not. Well, that's a very different study in terms of nuclear learning process. But I think more important question that you may ask even more, and I will just flag it and you can ask it the precise question, as to the evolution of military doctrines and nuclear doctrines within these post-nuclear test evolution. In particular, we are looking at the concept of limited war under the nuclear umbrella in various shapes and form. And that has, I would say, metastasized, but just continues to change over, both in terms of objective and responses. And that is something for students of strategy and South Asia is very interesting for them to study and understand. So I'm sure you have a specific question, I can answer that. Yeah.
I have many. Before we get too much further, I do think here it's important to just acknowledge that this is obviously one of those questions that is deeply controversial, and we are not going to resolve today the origin of crises in South Asia, and certainly acknowledge that there are different perspectives in India and Pakistan in terms of how crises come to be. One chapter that I would actually commend to those of you watching, it's a little bit older now, but back in, I believe it was 2017, Stimson South Asia program put out a really excellent volume called Investigating Crises. And the first chapter of that book by Hannah Higland and Samir Lawani looks at this question of crisis initiation and how and when crises triggers actually lead to crisis escalation and the idea of selecting into a crisis. So that's perhaps some good follow-on reading for those of you looking to understand and try to understand, at least up until that 2017 marker, what we'd seen in terms of trends for which potential triggers lead to crises and which don't. But first, I want to pick back up on what you were just nodding at, which I think is this question of the doctrinal elements of, what happens when we find ourselves in a crisis. How is maybe Pakistan specifically, but certainly curious for your thoughts on India as well. How has the strategy shifted over time with crises? And what are you seeing in particular out of this latest crisis where, we have crossed really unprecedented thresholds in terms of the systems that were employed, the geographies in which strikes were conducted, the number of strikes, the intensity of the fighting, right? So does that speak to a more fundamental shift in doctrine by one or both sides, either heading into the crisis or particularly now out of the crisis, as both sides kind of do their assessments and figure out what comes next?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. Again, Elizabeth, I will go back to what I said previously because I'll go back to the framework again. Again, I mentioned that in the post-Kargil period, we saw that there was this whole in terms of strategy and concept of the region, how it was evolving at the time post-nuclear test, So we saw that we went to the pathway. But after the Kargil conflict, India came up with this idea of a limited war under nuclear umbrella. And it's an important thing for me to define how they defined then, because it is relevant now and also in the future. And I think that also goes into the heart of your discussion with Raji the other day, which is that the way limited war, India found that after the Kargil war, there is space for a limited war. This is exactly how they define it. There is a space for a limited war between sub-conventional war and nuclear war. And in between is the space for conventional war, where India has preponderance over its adversary, namely Pakistan. And the wording that's explained, I'm going back to 2001, both with George Fernandez and the VP Malik, the Indian Army Chief, they were defining and actually speaking all over the world over this, saying that there is space that exists in which we should predominate. We can have success. And they also said something in that if there is no space, create that space. These are the exact words. That is a concept where the limited war, a preponderant or a more superior conventional forces, I'm using a register, can prevail over. And obviously, you mentioned geography. The Pakistani geography makes it so vulnerable for those kind of thought process to be done. And this is not just a nuclear 98 nuclear test. It has existed since the existence of Pakistan. So when in the 1980s, General Sundarji evolved those Sundarji doctrine where you could really go and elongated Pakistan and slice them into two, suddenly realized that with the nuclear weapons, those slicing the country elongated into two was not feasible because it will trigger the nuclear war. That's the evolution of their whole thought process as to what will happen. And after the 2001 and 3 standoff, they realized that this is not what's going to happen because Pakistan counter-mobilization advantage is going to lose the surprise in the process. So then they came with the Cold Star Doctrine, and I'm not going to details, you know what that meant. And then the Pakistanis came with full spectrum deterrence. So that realized that created that stalemate for the first decade of learning, if you will, or second decade or so. By around 2015-16 time, for 10 years from now, India started thinking of something even of a smaller scale, of a spectacular way, which is surgical strike. And the Pakistanis came back, what we must have heard so many times, quid pro quo, which they were to respond no matter what. So if you go back to what Raji was saying and you listen to what I'm saying, from what everything she's saying, she's giving a perspective as to how these challenges were actually being, how these changes were happening, both because of unfeasibility of success, but at the same time, the new technological evolution, new weaponry systems were making them feasible to create that space, even if it did not exist. But even today, if you recall, even as of last month, you will hear the Pakistani leadership, both military, civil, say there is no space for war in South Asia with nuclear weapons. If you hear from India, you hear something else, We have shown that there is space for war. Alluding to May crisis, alluding to Balakot crisis, we have created a new normal, Well, this is such a new abnormal. Let me tell you why I'm saying this, because this is not a new normal. This is creating more new abnormal. And again, it goes back to simple and complex learning. You're not learning from each other. You're thinking that you can succeed in the next round with a different way. Find different ways. And this is the evolution of doctrine in South Asia every time,
Yeah.
So one school of thought is, which I also mentioned in my book, was people may not agree with that. But when the Cold Star Doctrine came, the tactical nuclear weapons, they kind of neutralized it together. And I think both sides realized without acknowledging that has come and gone. And then they got into this surgical strike. By the way, it is important for me to point out here that both concepts of Cold Start and full spectrum deterrence was a very military, army dominated, land dominated concept. The Air Force and the Navy probably never agreed in India and Pakistan both, because that was not the dimension that they thought about. That changed. That changed in the last 6 years with what happened in Balakot, what happened in this war. You realize that there is a different dimension of aerospace element involved here, autonomous weapons involvement here, cyber involvement here, electronic warfare involvement, jamming new techniques are involvement, and new technologies involving both Western, Chinese, and Eastern, or you can name large number of technological things that came into prevention. So now this very concept that there is no space available and I'm going to create space available has qualitatively changed, because you can force a space. as you saw in May 25. But the result was that there is no one way of doing that. You do your war game thinking the enemy is going to really behave the way you think in your war game. The red land is going to behave the way the red land is going to behave because blue land will always win. But it doesn't quite happen this way. They come back with response. What do we know is that, and I have to say this, very frankly, I think both India and Pakistan have borrowed something from what has happened in the Middle East. I would say, namely from Israel. If Israel can do, I can do this to Pakistan, not realizing that Pakistan is not Lebanon, Pakistan is not Hamas, Pakistan is not the neighborhood in Israel.
Right.
And by the way, it's not that India is thinking only that. The Pakistanis do that to Afghanistan and Iran as well. The same analogy. If you think so. So both sides can say, I'm going to use force regardless whether it is sovereign country or the next door or not, if a threat emanates from there. And both countries will do so. But the only difference is that when India does to Pakistan, it has a significant, sizable conventional response as quid pro quo. It also has nuclear weapons. So they're not going to back down. They're not going to back down. So you can celebrate victory in India. You can celebrate victory in Pakistan because those tactical advantages or operational successes that you have respectively, you can celebrate the victory. But in the end, what do you learn? That was your question, You go back to learn how to dominate the next crisis again and beat the other guy. So we are looking into arms race instability and not assured whether we have a crisis stability of the kind that we have lived both in the Cold War as well as in the post-Cold War era. So I'm sorry, I have to end this particular answer in a more somber way, but there's no other way I can define, to be honest, given the kind of configuration that I'm watching both India and Pakistan happening now, is leading towards a different kind of crisis in the future.
No, and I think that's a warning well taken. I want to dive a little deeper on Pakistan's potentially evolving thinking here. So many of our viewers will have seen that Pakistan recently unveiled the idea of the Army Rocket Force Command. And Feroz, maybe I'll ask you to fill in a little bit of detail on at least where current understanding is of exactly what that means and how that fits into the mix. And particularly in the context of these broader reorganizations that are happening within Pakistan's military. So help us understand some of the structural changes that are ongoing right now in Pakistan, and maybe from that we can jump to a conversation about what that actually means in terms of how Pakistan is thinking about its options in a future crisis. So paint a picture for us of the evolving setup that we're seeing in Pakistan these days.
Yeah, I was there, as you already know, and you were also there at the time when all this was evolving. Frankly speaking, as of 2nd December, when you asked this question, there's a lot of, I have to answer this question with a caveat because a lot of things are not really clarity because the announcement of the rocket force was done after the nuclear test, and then we had the structural changes of the, 27th Amendment leading to the abolition of the chairman joint chief of staff and having the chairman joint chief, the chief of defense forces. Now, all these things have really created a lot of questions have been raised. I'll try to give you my best answer as to what I think is possible at the moment, what I think, But don't take me, it's a caveat that I'm saying that this is going to be, because they will come out with a clarity or so.
Sure.
So far, what we do understand is that at the minimum, we can understand that the role of the chairman joint chief of staff is taken over by a new appointment called chief of defense forces. And what we understand is that this is an extension of the army chiefs at the same appointment taken. So this is the announcement that now, how do we interpret this? At the minimum, we can interpret there's a difference that everything that the chairman was doing is now being done by the CDF. So everything comes under his command. But there's a subtle difference here. Chairman was not a commander. This is the command. There's a very different thing because chairman of a staff committee with 3 services in command is different than to have 3 command and somebody to be in command. So that means the organization structure has to now change based on that. Both the High Defense Organization, as it evolved in 1976, will get to know how that changes. Only then we can make very intelligent comment about it. right now, everything I'm saying is speculative.
Yeah.
And the second thing is how the National Command Authority or the Neutral Command Authority evolved as of 2010, you know, and in which the role of chairman and the role of SPD and the role of NCA, like the secretary you mentioned in my introduction as well. So how that is going to evolve. Not only that, we have a neutral command force commander, presumably a four-star general, who's going to have all the three strategic forces under command under him. And then because the chief of the army staff and the chief of the defense staff are the same people, so now under the chief of defense forces, we'll have what was called the Joint Services Headquarters, the JS. Under him would be the chief of general staff and the DGMO and all the GHQ. And then under him would also be SPD. Now it's a very curious role, which we don't know, whether the SPD would be answerable to the neutral commander as four-star commander. And then through that, the three forces will go, and the neutral commander will be reporting to the chief of defense forces, or the DG SPD will be part of the CDF, and the neutral commander will be just three forces command, and then from here will be going. If this is the case with SPD and GS headquarters together, we can see a greater integration of convention and military happening under the direct supervision of the chief of general staff, and GHQ and other services being merged. That's going to evolve. Now, theoretically speaking, that's going to show more coherence of command, more responsibility, more integration, etc., which was theoretically possible under the chairman since SPD and NCA was formed, but actually was not effective because chairman was not the commander. So in other words, the predominant of the forces would that. Secondly, it's important to know that this change is warranted because Pakistan's strategy essentially is predominantly land. You can see the land borders, 1,600 miles with Afghanistan and line of control and huge border with India. So from the very beginning, Air Force and the Navy was seen as more of a support services. But obviously, given the 21st century, Air and Navy have become very different forces altogether because of technological evolution and the changed character of warfare. Now, the announcement that has been made is that this was necessitated because of the changed character of warfare. You must have heard the announcement coming from there. Now, again, it has to be seen because the changed character of warfare, and given the fact that Pakistan is predominantly a land dominant strategy, how does the Air and the Navy and the technological company, not just the air, but aerospace actually, that's a bigger dimension of warfare that we saw in 2025. So, and then within this is the question that you asked with the rocket force. Prior to that, the rocket force was apparently the commentary that was coming was that, oh, well, the rocket force is a conventional force post May crisis created, and therefore, we needed to have a unity of command and sort of, have a firepower unity of command under conventional force and kind of segregate the neutral components separately. I have a different opinion about that because you don't make it clear when you're in neutral power, but that's a separate question. But now with this CDF-1 command, there's a rocket force command, and then there's a strategic force command, and there's a dual entanglement process here. Now my view, the dual entanglement is actually maybe a problem for the academics or problem for the arms controller, for CBS people. But in terms of deterrent signaling, it is more important that you create more ambiguity. You don't know which flight you're in. So if you're learning from the May 2025 crisis, if you go by the Indian claim, by the way, I'm not saying that the Pakistani claim, Indian claim, that they were able to intercept bulk of the Pakistani missiles that came into India, whereas the Pakistani claim is that they penetrated. We don't know how much the Pakistani actually admit how much of that was intercepted by India's anti-missile systems or air defense systems. We do know that S-400 were hit.
Right.
We do know that Indian aircrafts were shot down. But as far as the missile is concerned, that shooting down was purely an air battle with a standard weapon system, which we know. But this is a different battle that happened because Indian missiles penetrated into Pakistani air bases. Pakistani missiles were hitting some bases, and then there were drones, there were kamikaze drones, they were hitting all over. So that's a kind of warfare that did evolve, and the rocket force is a different force now. Whether they're going to have ballistic missile defense or anti-missile defenses over critical areas or very sensitive areas such as Rawalpindi, Chaklala, and other Sargodha bases, for example, and similarly in India. Or they're going to have offensive rocket forces that are going to, create a counter dissuasion strategy on them. This is all has to be evolved. So this rocket force is more bringing the unity, because in the 2025 crisis, while they were, whichever sector was North Command or Core Command, they were using from different sectors, but it will be a far more coherent rocket force from that sense.
Mm-hmm.
But how this change of 27th Amendment and this rocket force and the nuclear forces are going to be integrated has to be seen at the moment. So it'll be premature for me to make any comment beyond this.
Yeah. I think obviously that's an important caveat as we sit here on December 2nd and do our best to gaze into our crystal balls, which are, at least in my case, admittedly rather hazy. But I do want to follow up a little bit, right? So this kind of bigger picture question of how the nuclear threshold, nuclear umbrella operate in India-Pakistan crises, because at least my understanding of this is traditionally Pakistan has sought to lower the nuclear threshold in order to forestall any Indian conventional action, be it in the form of cold start or otherwise, right? To lower the bar so significantly through full spectrum deterrence that there is not room for conventional fighting under the nuclear umbrella. Of course, what we've seen in really the past few crises, certainly in 2019, in this most recent crisis as well, there was pretty significant conventional, at least exchange of strikes between the two sides that fortunately did not seemingly get close to crossing the nuclear threshold. And so, um, do you read Pakistan's thinking out of this crisis and just what seems to be kind of the reality that both sides are starting to approach as sensing that there is a greater degree of perhaps confidence in Pakistan's conventional capabilities? We've seen how impressively at least certain Chinese origin platforms performed in this crisis. Is Pakistan feeling a little bit more comfortable, or at least has come around to recognize that there is likely to be some sort of tit for tat exchange similar to what we've seen in previous crises, or perhaps drawing on what we've seen elsewhere, to the conflicts in the Middle East? Um, I will also reference, you might have seen the book that Rabi Akhtar, who's a professor at the University of Lahore, put out on the crisis, which was one of kind of the earliest reflections, an edited volume of reflections on the crisis.
We'll be working here.
Exactly, yeah. So in the introduction to that book, which was written by a longtime DG of SPD, General Khalid Kidwai, there was a really interesting quote that I want to get your reflections on as we try to understand this evolving kind of conventional nuclear interaction in Pakistan. So Kidwai writes, "The ARFC provides an additional layer of strategic deterrence between the operations of conventional forces and the potential employment of nuclear forces, thereby in some ways raising nuclear thresholds." What do you make of that and of this kind of broader conversation around expectations for limited conventional conflict in a potential future crisis?
Well, frankly speaking, I don't want to speak on behalf of General Kidwai because he would probably clarify even more, but I can only interpret what I understand. And I'm giving you the past 25 years of my study and my understanding. Now, on the face of it, the statement that, as you just read, and I also read this, what you just mentioned, seems to be contrarian to the message if you read the same statement from the same gentleman when he was in office, when he introduced the full spectrum deterrence with tactical nuclear weapons in 2012 timeframe. If you see the statements of that time, it was the other way around. And I'll tell you why that statement is coming. I'm not criticizing it, I'm just explaining what it is. Because at that time, the tactical nuclear weapons of a 60-kilometer into the battlefield nuclear weapons was introduced precisely to say, if you think that you have a space there to fight a battle on the borders at that level, you will be meeting a nuclear weapons in the battlefield, in your face, nuclear weapons, which means that you decide, enemy, you decide where the nuclear threshold lies. I'm going to keep the option available in the battlefield for you. Now, the word exactly was not, I'm lowering the nuclear threshold was never used, but there's no other way to interpret that. That's what it meant, you know. And if you go by Raji's interviews and many other from India, if I'm referring to that, they would say that, you know, you put yourself in a situation where your bluff could be called. Are you really going to use nuclear weapons in the vicinity of your own troops? Or is this just a bluff to deter me at the border, you know, or at the land? But notice I'm saying something there. If this discussion is evolving in predominantly a linear battlefield of a land strategy only. We are not looking into air. We are not looking into the sea at the moment. When we look at this statement, this is purely looking into the battlefield, the army's battlefield.
Mm.
This is exactly where it is, you know, getting situated, you know. So now, and that's what the whole interpretation was. There is no space for war, for conventional war between two nuclear armed power.
Mm-hmm.
You heard the army chief saying this in the last month in the PMA Kakul Academy parade as well. This is where the Pakistani, and that thing has not resided in anything. What the army, what I think I can give the best interpretation what General Kidwai is saying in that thing is essentially that we have now another option that we can give you a response back conventionally without resorting to nuclear weapons. If you think that you can find a space, you will find a conventional response of the kind that will still be too costly for you to think. In Pakistani thinking, to the best of my understanding, is they don't want India to get away victory on the cheap. That's exactly the term. So they're going to raise up the ante, whether they're going to raise it at the conventional level or keep the nuclear option open. That's why they don't declare any nuclear doctrine. So they keep that guessing work from the lower to the highest level.
Mm-hmm.
So one way to interpret it purely from the statement would be that he's talking about raising the threshold. But in effect, the Pakistanis are not giving up the threshold at any level of conflict, from tactical to operational. That has not been decided. So I don't really read too deep into this statement. But other than that, but again, we come back to this. This thing has come before this 27th Amendment change has come. So now we will see how the nuclear forces and other forces will be integrated. You know. Separately, many people have talked about that the Pakistanis did not use the BrahMos equivalent missiles, the cruise missiles in the battlefield in May 24. That might have been a different level of penetration on Indian air bases if the Pakistanis had done so. But those missiles like Babur, like Rad and others, that had come into the play with conventional warheads. The escalation of the battle would have been very different, you know. And I don't know the whole truth, but I would speculate that had the ceasefire not happened at 5 p.m. that day on 10th May, if this had gone to 11th or 12th May, clearly these missile systems would have come out and this would have had very different level of escalation. So, and I can talk more about how US intervention, I don't know what word, mediation, intervention, you can talk about that.
Yeah.
Because we had a long discussion on this. It mattered so much to bring this end at 5 p.m. because another night might have been very, very different. And I say this with the responsibility. Yeah, so that's my interpretation, you know, that the rocket force, and clearly it is needed, you know, because there's another artillery division at north and south and other, it was not as coherent. And in my understanding, maybe it was much more, I mean, you're using Fateh 1, your Fateh 2 rocket, but you needed more suddenly. I think if the lesson the Pakistanis have learned, which they're not coming out, I don't know in the strategic reckoning they have written or not the whole thing. But I think one thing is that they know that their air defenses, they need to do more about it. And secondly, they need to be more fire effectively so that they're not intercepted as much as India claims to be. These are the two lessons the Pakistanis are clearly learning. And obviously, in the next 4 or 5 years, that's exactly the trajectory where they'll be going. And obviously, at the same time, India will be, you know, doing the looking as to what happened to their Rafale, what happened to their air defenses, what happened to S-400. Both sides will be now correcting themselves. You say learning. They would have learned and mislearned, unlearned to undo each other for the next crisis. You know? So we are not looking into something that they have learned and said, look, we have destroyed each other, we have killed each other's, you know, this enough is enough. Let's sit down and talk. I don't think that that's happening as we speak, you know. I hope that changes, but at the moment it doesn't look like.
Yeah, it certainly seems, unfortunately in my mind, likelier than not that this is not going to be the last crisis that plays out between the two sides. And with that in mind, I wonder if you could reflect a little bit on um, how this could play out the next time around. Imagine if, as you say, both sides are learning lessons in terms of how to improve their own performance and efficacy and build up their defenses. Um, you noted the pretty significant role that the U.S. played in bringing this crisis to a conclusion this time around. I think probably worth reflecting on a bit how viable that might be going forward and greater or lesser challenges the US could face again as a third party, but kind of putting these pieces together, right? Um, how do we imagine that a future crisis could play out? Certainly, we've talked a lot about the air domain, land domain a little bit. Maritime domain hasn't come up as much, and so I wonder if you could paint us a picture of what we could be looking at going forward, and then from there, I'll ask you to think a little bit about what steps might be necessary now for those of us who are concerned about escalation risks and thinking a little bit about confidence building measures between the two sides to try to prevent uncontrolled escalation in a future crisis.
Yeah, I mean, if we are looking at the template of 2025 going forward, we didn't see much of land forces maneuver or stuff happening, and I don't foresee that happening. Maybe it could be more, land forces could be more like heliborne forces or
Mhm.
special forces striking across LOC or other places going on, if at all they decide to do that. Because after all, sometimes they have to justify that they also played a role. Um, I do see that you mentioned about the Navy part, given from the tabletop exercises we have attended and many of you have attended to as well. There's a clear indication that the Indian Navy wants to play a much more dominant role in the Northern Arabian Sea than they have been assigned so far, in a sense. So they claimed something that they destroyed something like a disinformation, but the Navy did not play any role in this particular crisis. But in the future crisis, it is quite likely that the Navy will be playing a role. Why do I say this? Just as we speak, about a month back, when you and I were in Pakistan, you may recall that there was an exercise going on, which was in that part. So the southern part of India, Pakistani southern part, southern half, gets into this desert part on the land, and then it gets into those creeks and that parts of creeks and that area, and then gets into the maritime domain. It's a mixture of two. And on the other hand, it gets into Baluchistan and into Iran. So you can see there's a very different sort of a terrain and the kind of warfare that happens in the southern part of Pakistan, India, compared to the northern part, which is Punjab and Kashmir and the northern part. That's a different configuration of forces. This is where the CDF will also be very important to see the north and south elongated Pakistani role playing in the future as well. We'll be having different forces. Uh,
Hmm.
North Command and South Command looking into the maritime zone, etc. So this is where the problem areas will be arising because maybe some event happening in Sirpet, they try to push it forward. So it will
Hmm.
get into this land maritime zone on the one hand. But it's going to be a predominantly air battle, and I think I'm just looking as an outside analyst. I don't, I recall what Raji said in her interview was that this hitting of the Pakistani bases was a messaging that they could do more. They
Hmm.
stopped by only doing so. Now, I think that this is something that the Pakistani side would have taken completely into note that this was penetrable, and they
Hmm.
will be doing a great deal to make sure that it doesn't happen. It could be possible that during crisis they may be more caps on the air, they may be having depth airfields, etc., to come back. Something could be happening of the kind to make sure that they can retaliate back in ways that is that will surprise India in a big way.
Hmm.
Big way that will surprise India in a big way, uh, in my view. It is quite possible that the Pakistanis will be looking for a different kind of anti-missile defense systems against. This will be the work in progress, although nothing is being said about it. And with the CDF in share, I'm sure this is going to be the major study as to how to do that. But the net result will be that I can almost say with certainty, this one, not speculation, that if any air base in the future war is hit in Pakistan, it's guaranteed that Indian air bases in the same range, the Pakistan-Indian ranges, with each one of them will be targeted in a big way. And that's where the missile force actually means what. This is where I am actually interpreting General Kidwai's statement here. That your bases, none of those bases will be immune. So this crisis is significantly different from the Balakot crisis, in which they deliberately avoided targeting military. And, in terms of both sides found an off-ramp. So this is the other part of the problem about third-party crisis I can say about this. This is where I kind of disagree with Raji's interview. And I think it's not that I disagree where she's coming from. I disagree because India was in a state of denial that mediation was not something that happened or that is effective or that should happen in the future. But to my knowledge, starting from brass tacks on to days, every intervention the US has been involved. There's not a single crisis in the US was not involved, one way or the other, in the diffusion of the crisis. If India believes that it can terminate the crisis on its terms and conditions, we have not seen that happening. We have not seen that happening, at least in the last two crises. We had an off-ramp of the pilot at the London last time, and this time we already know how the crisis ended. So for India to say that they can terminate the crisis when they want to terminate the crisis, both from my tabletop exercises and for years that I've done, as well as the real work that I observe, I do not see that there is any de-escalation strategy that you can end the crisis. You can start one, but you don't end the crisis on the way without third party, no matter what you call it. It has to be done. So that is one part of the problem that, this other part of the problem is the messaging part, which I again want to say something. Now, this is a huge disconnect between the two countries. We heard the Indian leadership saying that, we only hit the terrorist target, we didn't attack the military. We are nice guys, we're not trying to be nasty to you. Do you see that, how the Pakistanis interpreted that? I mean, you really think that this can really go unanswered? So obviously, anything that India does cross-border or cross-LOC will be answered back no matter what. The Pakistanis are not going to back down. And the reason for that is that as long as both sides have back pocket nuclear weapons with them, they are not going to back down. They'll keep on escalating till the time somebody says enough is enough. And I don't see any bilateral mechanism functioning in DGO hotline, border secretary hotlines, no matter what hotlines. These are not crisis diffusion mechanisms, to my knowledge. They can play a certain role to prevent a crisis, to verify prior to the crisis. But I'm not sure whether during the crisis they can play a crisis de-escalation role. Because these are DGM or these are military operation guys. What are they doing?
Yeah.
Their operation is their priority, not diffusion. So there has to be a different risk reduction system between the two countries and a different structure, as promised in the Lahore agreement, that they were going to do that. Only then we can find a mechanism of sorts that can create that. And I'm quite confident that India, Pakistan have tremendous amount of ideas how to do that. It's the political will probably on both sides that is not allowing them to happen. People to people don't want this strained relationship. But I know I've made both sides, Pakistanis don't like them. But actually this drift, the title of my book, is now becoming more and more and more and more. So, and I think one thing that you implied in the discussions, and I would bring about, what has happened after this crisis is that India, the Pakistanis, I'm more speaking about what I sense in Pakistan, and I'm sure you must have, they've started delinking themselves more, not necessarily as a South Asian junior partner with India, but trying to create a space in Southwest Asia and Middle East and Saudi Arabia and other places as well. So they find a niche out there that they are important, they're valued more there, compared to there. And the second thing that I also heard, and probably you also heard something more, the very notion that there is a mini South Asia that exists without India if India wants to be in a different place, like, a mini SARC, you remember that kind of discussion we had. So these are the kind of new ideas that are evolving. And I did not hear this maybe 2 years back or something, but these are new ideas that a good space with Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Nepal
Yeah.
and Pakistan is finding themselves. In other words, I mean, uh, all these smaller countries of India's neighbors have sort of thought, started thinking in terms that we have a sovereign right to determine our policy. Each one of them are member of the Belt Road Initiative. Each one of them have a relation with China. Each one of them are now figuring out to create economic and other space of common climate change, etc. and all. Other than India. So this is a part of the problematic part that we are witnessing. I mean, floods and climate change is affecting from Himalayas, both India and Pakistan. And you're talking about water treaty being irrelevant.
Mhm.
I mean, this relevancy of water treaty is so different now because the floods flowing from the same river are devastating both India and Pakistan together. So, what space are we talking here at the moment?
Yeah.
So this is the part of thing that, within this situation, we are creating a more crisis-prone region that rather than diffusing the crisis in a way where you can have greater integration. And I see this trend, you talk about key trend, these are the two different trends that I saw, which was very different. But frankly speaking, if you talk purely about Pakistan, Pakistani problem at the moment is more on the western borderlands, cross border with Afghanistan and what is happening in KPK and Balochistan. That's a far, far bigger and different level of instability. And I think there's much not realization in India, in my opinion,
Hmm.
that this instability is not good for India either. I'm not saying whether they're abetting or not, and just keep quiet on that because the Pakistanis seriously believe that.
Yeah.
But if the Indians are involved in creating that instability, it's not good for India as well. I could say that eventually it's gonna break them back. So that's not a good thing happening in the region.
Mhm.
But now we see that whatever has happened after May 25, ceasefire is holding on LOC or whatever pause or whatever they call it. I'm glad to see, and not that that the daily crisis that had happened. I mean, there was a suicide attack in Islamabad court, and at the same time it happened in Delhi. Both countries should have realized that we've got different level of problems in the country to deal with, rather than at each other's throat. I mean, come on. There's a different reality starting in your face.
I think those points are all well taken and helps us widen the aperture a little bit to the stark challenges that this region as a whole faces outside of this very specific question of crisis dynamics. And I think that's an important reminder to keep in mind. Maybe one silver lining that I did just notice in terms of relations between the two sides, India recently gave overflight permission for humanitarian flights from Pakistan to transit Indian airspace en route to Sri Lanka. So, as challenging and as fraught as relations are within the region now, it's always encouraging to see those small signs. And I think a lot of work to be done by both of us and others in this space to try to carve out even limited areas of opportunity for exchanging of views and comparing of perspectives as we head into the year to come in South Asia. So I could go on all day, but Feroz, we are at time. So I will just say thank you so much for making us smarter and sharing your thoughts today on strategic dialogues. It's been such a pleasure to have you. We'll have to have you back again soon. But thank you again for taking your time. And to our viewers, thank you to everyone for watching this episode of Strategic Dialogues. If you want to learn more about strategic issues in Southern Asia, I really encourage you to check out our suite of free online courses and resources at stratlearning.org. Please do let us know if you have any thoughts or feedback on the show, and stay tuned since we'll be back next month with another conversation on strategic dialogues. Thanks so much
Okay.
again, Feroz, and to all
Thank
of
you,
you.
Elizabeth. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Bye.